one, action. Welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billie. Today, my guest is Dr. Susan Strawn. I'll be right back with her and I'll introduce her to you. And I'm back with Dr. Susan Strawn. Dr. Strawn, tell us where you're situated right now. You're on the west coast of the United States?
I am. I live on Bainbridge Island, Washington.
Ooh,
it's
there's
about
some
a
good yarn
half
out
hour.
there.
It's beautiful, and it's a beautiful day today too, actually. And it's about a half-hour ferry ride from downtown Seattle.
Okay, so this is one of the most intimidating people I have interviewed because Dr. Strawn has 4 academic degrees that are each in different fields: psychology, biomedical illustration, library science, and textiles and clothing. Her dissertation for her PhD was entitled, you ready for this? Restoring Navajo Churro Sheep Community-Based Influences on a Traditional Navajo Fiber Resource and Textile. But there's more. Her numerous articles touch on also a variety of topics, particularly of interest to knitters and lovers of vintage clothing. She's written an article on Virginia Woods Bellamy's geometric number knitting, Coricelli Silk, Nordic dancing couple design for knitting, and embroidered Mexican souvenir jackets, which are not knit, but they are vintage. And I will put links to each of the articles that I mentioned in the show notes. And there's a plethora of other articles. If you Google her, I think you'll find many other articles. Now, the main reason that I invited her to be on Show and Tell today is that she has written what I consider to be the most comprehensive book on the history of knitting that I've ever seen. Not that I'm a maven. It's called Knitting America, A Glorious History from Warm Socks to High Art. And it touches on every period of knitting since the birth of our nation. I'm not going to show a lot, but I just want to give you a little glimpse of how rich in illustrations. One illustration that in particular that jumped out to me was this one from my favorite museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right here in New York City, of the Victorian Hatch family, which of course that painting is in the American wing, and it is on display right now if you find yourself in New York. She must have scanned, I don't know if we're going to get into this, but she must have scanned virtually every historical society across the country, all sorts of libraries and museums. But she doesn't just talk about knitting. She gets into the historical context about different societal groups, products, patterns. So I wanted to just read a very, very short snip from the foreword by Melanie Fallock, who says that she describes how knitting is intertwined with such subjects as geography, migration, politics, economics, female emancipation, and evolving social mores. In fact, Dr. Strawn herself, in the introduction to the book, says, if you close your eyes and place your finger on any page of this book, you'll find a topic for a thesis, dissertation, or biography. And I could not agree with that statement more. It is so rich. I mean, I didn't spend enough time with it. I would need days, weeks, maybe years to process. There's so much information, and it's beautiful in addition to all of that. So, having said all of that, let me start getting down to the nitty-gritty. Obviously, Dr. Strawn could talk about any one of a number of topics, but I tried to focus in on an area of interest, I think, to most viewers of this podcast: knitwear in the interwar period. So let me ask you, what type of knitwear would you say was popular during my favorite period, the Art Deco period?
Well, I would just preface it a little bit by saying that it really shows the fashion legacy of World War I, knitting for the soldiers, for the troops, and that the fashion legacy of World War I was the sweater. And so during Art Deco, which is Art Deco, mainly associated with the 1920s, you see a lot of sweaters and a lot of long sweaters, cardigans. You see them looking very, very lean and very tailored looking. And I used to teach this as kind of a shorthand for it, was that, well, you can recognize Art Deco by verticality, emphasis on tall, lean, and by repeating geometric shapes. Think the Chrysler Building. Repeating geometric shapes. And you'll see this in the sweaters, in some of the stitch designs, and in some of the striping that goes on in the 1920s in those sweaters. But you'll also see a smoothness and a reflective surfaces often in the 1920s fashion, and that's in everything. That's in buildings and architecture, in machinery, and everything, and in fashion in general. And then in the 1930s, you really shifts more toward it's called art moderne, which is streamlining. And streamlining was all about selling technology and optimism to the masses during the Great Depression. And this is when, advertising really comes into its own. And they are really working hard with psychological principles to sell this. And streamlining, again, it was trains and architecture and clothing, everything was streamlined, pressing irons, everything was streamlined. And the idea with this, that this was forward thinking, it was to suggest movement to a better future as they were bogged down in the Great Depression, and to get people buying as well. And so you see this in clothing at the time, and you'll see this in knitting. I was just looking through some of my knitting pattern books, and indeed you see kind of streamlined, knitting fashions as well. So the knitting, they really follow along with the mainstream fashion. And like 1920s, interestingly, there was very little knitting going on, and it could be that people were just burned out from all of the knitting they did during the wartime for the troops. It could be that knitting brought bad memories for them and they didn't want to knit. It could just be that the 1920s were so affluent and people were so ready to party after the war that they just
no time to knit.
Yeah,
give me that cocktail.
Yeah, exactly. But then in the 1930s, when we get into the Depression years, boy, knitting just comes roaring back. And again, it's really helped along with all the yarn manufacturers who are training who are publishing books with knitting patterns. That's where a lot of the patterns come from, is from the yarn manufacturers who want to sell yarn. And they're training needlework instructors who go out to the department stores. They're organizing fashion shows. They're having contests with fabulous prizes to these contests. And they're designing things like suits so that people will have to buy the yarn for a skirt as well as for the jacket. And the suits, of course, influenced by the brilliant work of Gabrielle Coco Chanel, who really popularized knits, back in the 20s and the 30s, but also Elsa Schiaparelli, who
I saw that you mentioned Schiaparelli in the book, and the trompe l'oeil sweater. I knit that sweater.
Wow.
I didn't knit it in black and white like everybody else. I knit it in shocking pink because that was the other color. And I asked around some people who were knowledgeable about her and her work, and they said it's possible that it was done in colorways other than black and white. So I thought, well, okay. And then I went to Paris this past January to see the sweater that was in a Schiaparelli retrospective. So I saw the original.
Fabulous.
There's more than one original of that sweater.
Mm-hmm.
So just as an aside, but in the book, I mean, if I can digress a little bit, you mentioned that they used a 3-needle technique. Do you know what that was? Because this is the first I'm hearing that. I knew that it was Armenian with stranding, which I do. I did mine in Tarja just to, make a little shortcut. But do you know actually how it was done?
I don't, but I can tell you who probably does. I think Meg Swanson, the daughter of Elizabeth Zimmerman, has studied this, and I believe she put out a book about Armenian knitting. And I have not followed up on that. But if I were to try to find the answer to your question, that's where I would start, would be with Meg Swanson, and Schoolhouse Press would have published that book.
Yes, I'm aware of that because that's where I got the pattern. But you saw somewhere that it said with a 3rd needle?
No, I don't know. I have not followed up on that. Like you said at the beginning, you kind of put your finger down anywhere and think, wow, there's a question to be answered.
Okay. Because I want to know, because I had not heard that before. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry I can't answer that particular one.
That's okay. Now, getting back to Art Deco, I mean, I don't know if you're done, but Art Deco was such an unusual movement because it really made its way all around the world, from Europe, Japan, Australia, I mean, just everywhere. So I wondered if you could say something about how the Art Deco knitted fashion may have varied from continent to continent, and how disparate lifestyles influence the knitwear choices, and then further, what were the color choices that they were using, if you know?
Yeah, that's good. I study American knitting, so I'm not so interested in what people were knitting in other parts of the world, with exceptions. What I'm interested in is what happened to how those different techniques from different countries, how those were expressed in this country, how Americans adapted them. So I don't always know that much about what people were knitting in other parts of the world. But I think kind of the obvious answer would be that some places were more affluent than others. Some places were able to tap into French fashion and make use of that. It gets very complicated in terms of how designs are imported, what can be imported, and so on. But by this time, certainly people are traveling a lot more, so they're bringing back these ideas. They are using, there's plenty of yarn to be used, to be had there. You can order directly from the mills. You can get from department stores. A lot of people opened little shops in their homes to sell yarn, so you could get yarn anywhere. And of course, along with yarn, how do you sell yarn? You sell the patterns. And so, they're going to distribute the patterns. And I have not found a lot. I was kind of looking through my own collections here, and I just don't find a lot in the 20s and 30s of pattern books that describe patterns from other cultures and other nations. I just don't find that so much. If people were doing that, it didn't come up. And again, it was American manufacturers who were designing these pattern books. So
the colors.
The colors, I think, when you look at the colors, I mean, if you look at colors being used in quilting and in quilts, I think it's very similar. I think colors in fashion, in knitting, in quilting, in home decor, they tend to be very similar. They tend to be similar to one another. So you see, the kind of blue grays and gray colors, black and whites, I think are very, maybe not so much bright colors, especially during the Depression. Things get a little more subdued. You see even Depression era quilts, they're kind of shades of gray and so on. And of course, some of the dyes, we were cut off from a lot of the dyes during World War I. So new dyes had to be invented, and the new dyes weren't always as intense as some of the older ones had been. So there are so many different moving pieces that go into answering that. But I think in general, when I see colors that are, kind of those muted, beautiful grays and blues, and those colors, they're kind of pastels, but they're really interesting pastels. They're not like baby pastels. They're really pretty. I think of that as 20s and 30s, and I think black and white too. Black, I think, was really popular.
Well, we see the whole period in black and white because of the movies. All the movies from that era, which we're so familiar with, are always in black and white. And I always sit there and wonder, like, for example, in the women, what were the colors that they were all wearing? They could not have all been wearing black. Some of them had to be wearing midnight blue or Persian blue, or, something. Maybe some people were even wearing red and browns. I'm imagining, but it's left up to our imagination unless you have the color cards from the yarn manufacturers with swatches. I have to get to the Metropolitan Museum. I bet in their archives they probably have, because they have a whole textile branch. They might have some of those old. I hadn't thought of doing that until now, but maybe I need to trip uptown.
Absolutely, and those sample books and things are just worth their weight in gold in terms of learning about the authentic colors and patterns and so on that were being used and that were being sold. And so you even find like salesman sample books and so on. I've come across these in
that's what
libraries.
I mean.
It's just a treasure.
Yeah, I'd like to see those colors, because when I knit vintage, I would like to be able to knit it in the original colors. Now, the things that are in the museums, all right, we get to see, there are some like Chanel sweaters in museum collections, so you can see those. But in terms of what the typical American housewife was knitting for herself, I'd like to see those salesmen's books. Maybe someday.
Well, one piece of research I did that was really interesting was in a series of trade manuals. They were called the Dry Good Merchants Trade Journal, and it was basically it was the 1930s to the 1960s. It was the heyday of the department stores, and basically they sent editors. This was like my dream job. They sent their editors out to different department stores around the country, and they interviewed. Well, they interviewed in workwear department in all different departments, but I was focused on needlework departments in the department stores, and they would interview them about what they were selling, what colors were they were selling, who was buying the yarn, how they were promoting the yarn, how they were displaying the yarn, how they had how they were teaching, how they were selling the patterns, who their customers were, and how they were accommodating their customers, which was just a fascinating. So every week they had a new report from these editors from all over the country. Fargo, North Dakota to Austin, Texas, New York City to California. And it was a fascinating insight into how they were selling these things and who was knitting what, the ages, the types of clothing and so on that they were knitting. It was just a wonderful bit of insight. No samples, unfortunately, but a lot of history.
So would you say that that was the main way that people were procuring yarn at department stores, or was
department stores? Yes, department stores were very important. I decided after reading that department stores are really important. And the really interesting thing about the Dry Good Merchants Trade Journal was that they named names. It was like Mrs. Gluck at such and such a store in Fargo, North Dakota is the main buyer of yarn, and this is what she says, and others. And so it was all the names and specific locations, which, usually these are anonymous people. And I love that, bringing attention to these people who were like the unsung heroes of the industry at the time. So, but people could order directly from the mills. Over time, I've gotten a lot of these magazines, these, early magazines that I just find around and on other sources too. But advertisements are really important in understanding how things were being sold, because I find all these ads for buy directly from the mill, so they could get yarn directly from the mill, and they could buy from, and a lot of women set up yarn shops in their homes. The
How
first yarn shop,
interesting.
yeah, the first yarn shop I ever went to was in a little area in rural Nebraska, and I was just a kid, and I didn't know anything but, buying yarn at the Find and Dime or something. And the knitters there was a woman in this little town of 1,000 people who saw that I was knitting, and they said, "Oh, we've got to take you to our yarn shop," which was in a woman's home. And she had yarn from all over the world, patterns. It was just fabulous. It was like opening the door to the world to me and to other cultures through yarn and through her yarn shop, and it was at home. And I find references to that in these early women's magazines from the 1920s and 30s. There are lots
And
of ads and lots of
there's
descriptions of that.
many of these ads in the book.
Yes, they're fun.
Reproductions of those ads, and they're fascinating. The ads, the circular needles, and different kits that were available, and whatever the newest gadget was. The
Right.
book is rich.
Oh, thank you. Well, there was, of course, Sears and Wards. They were selling all over the country and had been for decades. So it was readily available. You also had like Mary Maxim from Canada. You had more downscale places like Hirschner's. And a lot of these, they started out with immigrants who had little push carts and they were selling household goods, and they built them into large department stores, and like Hirschner's built them into large craft stores. Really interesting history and how needlework played a role in helping people develop these important businesses, which then became mail order.
They're still around, right?
And they are. They're in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. I've been there.
And Mary Maxim's still around as well.
It is. And all these little snippets that I learned, like Mary Maxim, I wondered about where that name came from. And it turns out it's kind of like Betty Crocker. It was a name they made up. And I had just, a lot of times, because I was teaching full time while I was writing this, I couldn't travel as much as I would have liked to. So I just, depended on email. And I emailed the Mary Maxim company and said, "Well, what do you have for history? I want to know where you started." And I got an email back from one of their, I don't know, CEO or something saying, "I wrote a little history of that and I presented it, never published it, but I presented it. Would you like to see my notes?" And, and right there, it was the history of Mary Maxim came from the name of Mary Maxim Chuck, his check made. And they just turned it to Mary Maxim and decided to call it the Mary Maxim Company. I don't know. I love all that little
That's
odds
great.
and stuff.
It's a great name. It's got a little catchiness to it.
Yeah, it's an alliteration. So I think I kind of got off topic here, but we're talking about selling yarn. And the other thing about the 20s and 30s, especially the 30s, this is when advertising really comes into its own. I mean, in the past, like the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, maybe you've got a jar of Lydia Pinkham's, potion or something, and they'll say, "Here, this is it, buy it, it's good, this is what it costs." You get into the 1930s, there's a huge shift, and what they sell is lifestyle. And there's a book called, let's see, Selling the American Dream, and that describes this, and they still use it today. You look at the next ad you see, and you'll see people looking happy using the product. They're selling the lifestyle. They're not selling the product, they're selling the lifestyle, because we don't need any more stuff, let's face it. They're selling the lifestyle, and they learned to do that in the 1930s, and that's what the yarn manufacturers learned to do. By selling suits, by having fashion shows, contests, they're selling the excitement and the lifestyle. So that's what a lot of what was behind the 1930s boom in knitting, which I think that's really interesting.
It's all interesting. I'm interested in the yarns themselves.
Okay.
What types of yarns were they using? Boucle? I mean, I don't think they were using merino.
Oh, they were using wool. Certainly it was wool. They often referred to Shetland wool, which seemed to mean a fine weight of wool. But at that time, I mean, America raised a lot of sheep back then. So wool was available. It was a renewable resource, really
But
important to
just,
wartime
you think
knitting.
just one breed? There must have been many different breeds. So I've seen
Yeah,
labels like lamb's wool,
right.
or
The,
virgin wool, whatever these things
yeah,
are. But in terms of like the texture of the wool, today we have some yarns that are very smooth and slippery. But I'm imagining back then, well, Shetland wool today is noted for its stickiness, and probably back then too, because it was used for color work and steeking. So you couldn't have
yeah.
something that was slippery that would just unravel. So I'm imagining that Shetland wool, yes, was available, but I wondered if boucle was popular or if there were other
Yeah.
textures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think wool, I mean, wool was what we had, wool and cotton. That's what everything was until we got it. But I actually looked up some of this to be sure I had my dates right. And um, the first, well, they're not, these are not synthetics, they're regenerated cellulose products. They're made from paper, from, rayon was the first one. And they called it artificial silk. And the big problem that came up, like turn of the century or so, and the problem was that it was flammable, and so it was rather dangerous, but it was sold as artificial silk because it has a nice luster to it. And rayon was certainly being used for knitting, I think, by the 20s and 30s. There's probably some in there. 1930s, you did get these boucle, which was really popular. And the advantage of these regenerated cellulosics is that they will hold a crimp. And I have one here that I pulled out. I see these as rescue missions when I buy things in antique malls and so on. But look at this. Look at that. The sweater it's made. That's just got kind of 1930s, I think. I'll back up a little bit so you can see it. Look at that. And it's got a skirt with it. And a necktie, which seems to have fallen out somewhere. But this has got to be rayon. And you see the crimping in it where it's been raveled a little bit. And this is a boucle where it's been spun in a certain way so that you get that nubbiness. But I was so excited when I found, so now here's a color, original color, 1920, 1930s, and you have this kind of little bit of an ecru, and you have, and look at those buttons.
Wow.
Oh, that's
Love
what I said too. I know, it's just wonderful. And I'll just hold it up so you see the closeness of it. See, it's a drop stitch. It's a vertical drop stitch that they're using, and it's vertical. So, and very streamlined in the thing. So it's, yeah, that's boucle. There we have it.
Will you show the strand of yarn again? It wasn't
Sure.
close enough to the camera.
Sure. It's you can just see that I had some of it it wasn't finished. This was an unfinished piece, which is probably why it was.
Just hold it up more near your camera.
You got it, getting there.
Okay.
And it's up like that. See how but rayon will kind of hold the crimp. If it were wool, you'd have some crimp there, but this is really strong crimp. So I'm sure that this is rayon, although I haven't done a burns test with it. If I wanted to know exactly, I would do a burns test. I used to teach textile science too. So boucle definitely really popular.
It looked like it had some little metallic sheen or something.
Well, that's rayon.
Burgundy.
Rayon has a sheen to it. That's why they called it artificial silk, because it had a sheen, it had a luster.
It looked like it was two tones though. It looked like it was burgundy and then like a little silver. A little thread that you held up. It didn't look like it was a solid color.
It is a solid color. Yep, there's just a luster.
So the shine is picking up as like
yeah. So that was popular. The name was adopted, I found, in 1924 for rayon. Rayon itself. Before that, they had a similar fiber, but it was available in the 1920s. And acetate also was available in 1924, and that had some problems to it, and mainly it's used for woven linings now. And yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting. The rayons and acetates both regenerated cellulosic fibers. And when you get to the synthetics, um, those are made from basic materials, usually petroleum based. 1928, we had nylon, and the nylon mainly for hosiery. And you don't get polyester till 1951. So in between the war, no polyester, not till post-war. And acrylic, that was like an artificial wool. And that was actually invented late 19th century, but it took a while to get into knitting. A lot of times, you have war, and there's a lot of innovation during wartime in fibers and sewing and construction, all kinds of materials. And then when the war ends, manufacturers have to figure out what to do with all these new inventions. And that's a lot of what happened with, like with acrylic and with polyester. And of course, clothing was one of the main ways that they used it. And so, yeah, 20s and 30s, though, no polyester yet. Not really nylon for knitting yet, but yeah.
In all of your research, do you ever come across, or have you ever come across repositories of vintage patterns?
Oh, yeah, that was an interesting question. I really love happenstance. I love serendipity. I love it when I just come across something, or somebody gives me something, that they found, or um, a lot of a lot of the pattern books I have from World War I were retrieved from a trash barrel by a woman who was out walking her dog and said, I thought you'd be interested in this. And they were like annotated with the knitter's notes, and they were all about World War I knitting. And I pulled out another one here. This one, for example, get this out of here. This is a Florence knitting silk book from a little booklet from 18 something or other, 1882. I found that in a flea market in Mason City, Iowa. I mean, I'm just kind of poking around looking at old stuff, and there it is. And what I ended up doing, there were beautiful patterns in here, beautiful patterns for fine detailed mittens knit from silk. Well, silk, I sort of overlooked that, but there was a silk industry originally in the US, which is another whole history. And I ended up knitting a pair of the mittens from that I'll put up here. They're really darker. I never did finish those. There they are on the little, but the pattern's pretty fun on that. So usually I'll get, isn't that pretty?
It's fantastic. What size needle is that?
Probably a 00. Yeah.
The smallest I've knit with is a 1, US 1.
Okay.
I have not gone below that. So
okay.
I thought those looked like they might be teeny.
They're teeny. They certainly are. And just where you find these things. I lived in Chicago when I was teaching, and I lived in Seattle during the summers. And I went to every summer. I spent most of my time at the Seattle Central Public Library, which has an entire floor, and this is a huge library, an entire floor of bound periodicals. And the bound periodicals are focused on late 19th, early 20th to the mid 20th century. It was a treasure, a treasure. These things are bound. So I went through all of the women's, needlework publications, through Ladies' Home Journal, through all of these publications that might have, page by page. They have a writer's room there that I had access to, so I could go into this writer's room, have access to, the room where it was private, but then have access to all of these wonderful bound periodicals. I went through them page by page by page, finding the patterns that I've written about and that were in the book. And I love it. It's so much fun. And then I also, as I was traveling, my road trips between Chicago and Seattle, and also in Chicago, but also in Colorado, where I lived for a long time, I just found, pattern books like this one I just had pulled out. This was from the 1930s. I was looking to see if there was any, Fair Isle type knitting, and I'm just not finding it. And so I have about 6 linear feet of pattern books like that as well, but they've all just been, kind of accumulated. So the only repository I found was like at the Seattle Central Library, and I had to work for that, go through all of them. There is an organization called the Center for Knit and Crochet, CKC. They're headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, and they are kind of crowdsourcing some patterns. Have you run across them?
I have, because the founder is sometimes in New York at Vogue Knitting Live, so I've met her.
Jennifer?
Jennifer,
Or
she wants to come on the show. Jennifer, if you're watching, this would be the moment.
Jennifer Lindsay is really keeping this going, which is great. I think it's wonderful. The closest I found is called the Knitting Library. It's at the University of Southampton in Winchester and in Southampton, England. And the way that I found that was that I was a regular attendee at symposia called In the Loop. And this was organized by a librarian at the University of Southampton. And she's also started the Knitting Library, and they accept the papers of some prominent knitters like Bishop Rutt, for example. They have all of Bishop Rutt's papers from his research for his book about the history of knitting. They have Monsie Stanley's papers. She was a British designer. And so they have all these things that they had gathered, that they had collected. And that's about the closest that I've found. Other than that, I just had to go to whatever museums. If I was presenting a paper somewhere, I would just contact someone who was at a museum nearby. So I went through, well, the Smithsonian, of course, I went through theirs. They actually didn't have that much. And what they had, it appeared that they bought for the most part, which was kind of shocking. But the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR Museum in Washington, D.C., a fabulous collection. Really well documented. That's where I found Thomas Jefferson's hand knitted slippers.
I saw those in the book.
Probably knitted by enslaved people, because during that time it was considered a proper occupation for people who were enslaved. And the Washington family had particular enslaved people they owned who were designated knitters for them. And it's kind of interesting. I ran across information like, sorry, I'm just kind of diverging here, but I just love talking about this stuff. So I just kind of go on and on.
No, it's great. Perfect.
But, I could run across things like, well, Martha Washington was our first knitter and she was knitting at Valley Forge and everything. And it's like, no, actually, that kind of thing is the product of the xenophobia that struck the country in the 1920s when they passed all the laws to keep out immigrants. And during that time, you were also asking about, I think you were asking about how other traditions came into, or how patterns and designs moved around from continent to continent. And I thought, when I started writing this book, I thought that I would find, let's just say, because I know the most about them, about Norway, let's just say I thought Norwegian immigrants, and they were second only to Irish, by the way, in terms of sheer numbers of immigrants who came to this country. Norwegian immigrants, I just thought they would be knitting their Setesdal sweaters while they were in the hold on the ships coming over. Well, actually, no, they would knit maybe, just practical things like mittens from the sheep that they raised. And they actually, this is just anecdotal, but from people who grew up with these traditions, who are now in their 80s, said that no one would wear any of those Norwegian peasant garments, because that meant you were poor. It meant you were too poor to buy things in a store. And so that actually put a damper on wearing a great deal of on a lot of these motifs coming into the country. And it wasn't until they really became sort of prestigious to knit these other kinds of patterns influenced by other countries. And another thing I did was to trace from Norway how Nordic motifs began to be associated with skiing. And it's so embedded, but it was not always like that. Norwegians didn't wear those things to ski. They would just wear regular clothing. And it was the development of the American ski industry, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, that had a campaign in the late 1930s and 40s to keep skiing Norwegian, and they used these Norwegian knitting motifs to brand the ski industry. And then it was picked up by manufacturers, and within 10 years, it was closely associated with skiing. And that's how it happened. Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. I'm trying to remember the name of the ski shop. When I was growing up in Philadelphia, there was a ski shop, and my mother used to go there to buy me sweaters, not because I was skiing, but because they were great sweaters.
Yeah.
I still have at least one, maybe two. I wish I could remember the name.
Oh.
It'll come to me after we're done.
Maybe
this chat.
Jansen, maybe Jansen
No.
did that. Another one. Okay. Well, it
wasn't brand. It was like the neighborhood ski shop. So it was like Alsberger ski shop or somebody's name. It'll come to me. Maybe there's even a label in the sweaters. I still have. I could go look.
I wanted to briefly go back to the subject of wool and using wool, and Shetland, when that term was used, there wasn't a lot of strict regulation about terminology back then. That's a more recent thing. And I think that they just kind of threw that word Shetland in. I don't think it really meant that the yarn was necessarily from Shetland. I think maybe they knew about Shetland, but I think it just referred to a kind of a fine, weight of wool yarn. And I don't know. My friend Deb Robeson. Oh, you should interview her sometime. She knows all about the sheep. She knows all about the different varieties of sheep, their history in depth, where they were. She's done just exemplary research on that, and she could tell you exactly what sheep were being used at any particular time. That is her area of expertise. It's just fabulous. So I just wanted to clarify that the merino, they really used those because they were good for manufacturing, and they bred them for white so that they could dye the wool. And there's been so little price support for sheep that you can't get money for raising sheep anymore. So it's kind of hobbyists or people who are really devoted to raising Lincoln sheep or Shetland sheep or whatever, to getting their wool spun and doing these wonderful local yarns that we have now that we can choose from today. So it's the knitters, the crocheters, who are keeping those breeds alive, I think, because that's who's interested in buying that wool.
My husband and I were on a cruise in Alaska several years ago, and we met this couple from Australia. And when we were seated at dinner with them, the man told us that he was a sheep farmer. And I was smacking my chops because I thought, oh, great. Now I can go directly to the source and I'm going to get like great Australian yarn for really good prices. And then he said, no, my micron length is the wrong length for anything that would touch the skin. They buy it up in China from me at really low cost to use in carpets.
Huh. Interesting.
Oh, well, dreams dashed.
I've written a story, part of my memoir. I wrote a story about a group of nuns on Shire Island in Washington. And we get up there one of these days. I visited about 20 years ago, and they raise Cotswold sheep, and they have that spun into yarn. And I'm going to get back up there and kind of see what the status of that is right now. I'm in touch with them, and the trip up there fell through this fall, but I'm going to go next spring. And it's all over. You never know when you're going to come across some sheep and wool, and they're raising them for the yarn market. At llamas too, but they raise Cotswold sheep because they're well acclimated to the Pacific Northwest. So you just gotta, as I said, happenstance, serendipity. It's just great when it happens.
Since you raised the topic of travel,
yes,
one of my questions for you was about how your research and presentations on a wide range of textiles have led you to 34 countries.
Okay. Okay.
from Peru to Uzbekistan. So tell
Mhm.
us something about your travels and the research that you've done in these places. And then, by the way, like, you know, if there's a culture of knitting, like Farrell
Mhm.
sweaters we know about, and Ganzis.
Okay.
You're writing also about that, your travels, or that's just
Yes.
a memoir?
No, I'm writing about that, and since you gave me a nice leadway into that, that's what I've been writing. What I've really been excited about writing lately are these like 1,500 to 2,000 word kind of stories that combine knitting and travel and memoir. You know, what I was doing, why I was there, what I found, who I met, that type of thing, and just making a little story out of it. So that I just opened my Substack account and I'm going to start posting this month. They're from all the way from Iowa to Norway to Alaska to Shaw Island. So just wherever, I just want to kind of take readers along with me on some of these journeys that they may not have gotten to go to. So let's see, what can I talk about with that? I don't know. I just was kind of curious about what there were in other parts of the world, and as an academic, I would present things in you know, papers and research different places, and I was always interested in the history of knitting. So I started when I was in graduate school. Well, I worked at Interweave Press for quite a while, and I started writing some knitting history at that point. And then when I went back to graduate school, studying historic and ethnographic textiles, then um, every time I had a chance to write a paper, I would write about, you know, knitting history. And then kind of anyway, so I just always had my eye open for it. Anytime I went to a conference, I would see what other museums were there, make an appointment with the curator and see what they had. And when I was out here in Seattle, I would go to, say, the Washington State Historical Society, and usually they liked that because it gave them a chance to kind of get into and see what they were doing. Um, and so the In the Loop conferences were important to me. They were held in the Shetland Islands and in Winchester, England. And as many people do, just fall in love with the Shetland Islands. It's just such a beautiful place and such warm people. So the knitting traditions there are just fabulous, just wonderful. So, you know, I had the chance to go through their their collections and so on. But the best part was that I was at an agricultural show, which is like a county fair. It just pops up for a day. And I went to see the display of all the local producers, knitters who put things up in competition for the show. And met someone there, bought something from her, and she invited me to spend a day with her. She was just, you know, a local woman who knitted. And so we went out. She took me out to the mills, and we just went all around the country, saw the countryside, saw the sheep out there. It was just such a delightful time. And it turned out that she was actually a really famous knitter, and she had knit a lace baby blanket for Prince William. And I mean, it was just
How is
very
that?
very humble people. So anyway, that was so just stories like that is what I've had fun with. Some places like Uzbekistan, India, I just don't find much in the way of knitted traditions. In those countries, you know, knitting was introduced. And so they're relatively modern. In Peru, I went to Peru with a cultural exchange, mainly with Navajo weavers that I'd gotten acquainted with while I was writing my dissertation. And so the knitting there is just so amazing. And that, of course, was introduced by the Spanish. They came in just like um, knitting was introduced by the Spanish coming into, and sheep for that matter, coming into the Southwest. But that was really fascinating to see those amazing knitters there. Ireland the same way. I really, but what I really, I mean, I've been to Estonia and Russia and Finland and all that, but I kind of I do prefer to focus on American knitting since I'm American. And I like, if at all possible, to leave the expertise in those nations to the people who live there, and it's their own heritage. So I don't tend to get involved with that except, you know, writing about it as I go over and have some nice experiences and enjoy it. And um, so, yeah, I just sometimes I had friends living in places like Zambia, ended up meeting a bunch of knitters in Zambia, because just traveling around with some friends, um, we came across a group of knitters, and sometimes these have been introduced by Peace Corps volunteers. And one of the more interesting things I had experiences in Peru was, I don't speak Spanish, but I met a group of women who were knitting those, those little finger puppets that you see all over now, which I'm told were Peace Corps project introduced that. But they were knitting all these wonderful little animals, and you've seen these. I've got like 100 of these things that I bought down there, and the little children would put them, little ones like 3-year-olds would put these things on their fingers and come running up and waggle them at the tourists, and you buy them from them. But I'd take my knitting out. Often I would take out my knitting and I would just go sit with anyone I saw knitting. And it didn't matter that we didn't speak the same language. We'd start finding common interests through our knitting. Like maybe we were doing the same kind of picot, edging. For example, I ran into that in Peru. I was using it on socks. She was using it on a sweater. And so it was like we both spoke knitting, so we could connect that way. And the women who were knitting these little finger puppets, I was asking if they had patterns, and just using sign language. And they finally got the idea, and they said, "Oh yeah, where do we get the pictures?" And they brought out this stack of National Geographic magazines. These women were taking National Geographic magazines, pictures of zebras and giraffes and so on, and making these tiny little pieces. Isn't that astonishing? So those are
But it was just in their head. There was nothing written down.
No, they didn't write it down. No, it was just in their head, and they just made them up, and they were just happy, and their kids were around them. They were knitting, and then they can sell them, and kind of.
That's like, grandma's pound cake. How did you make your cake, grandma? Well, I took 12 eggs, and I took 2 cups of flour, and I sprinkled in a little of this and a little of that, and no real written down recipe. It's just,
well, I was just in awe.
down.
I was in awe of them, I have to tell you. I just thought that was so wonderful. And so I don't know, just more of these things keep occurring to me. After I did my dissertation, I wanted to, kind of encouraged to try to give something back. So I went down to the Sheep is Life celebration, which is this big thing celebrating Navajo Cheryl sheep down on the reservation, and arranged to teach some knitting classes, which was kind of fun because I got some of the older weavers who kept trying to, weave the yarn. It was really tight. They were trying to do their weaving as they were knitting. It was really hard for them to relax and just knit. But the younger weavers, boy, they just pick it right up. Man, it's like it's in their DNA to work with fiber. They were really good. So that was kind of fun. I haven't written that one up yet. I need to do that. So that's kind of what comes to mind, I guess, is oh yeah, and being in the Shetland Islands one year, there was an artist, Kristen Lindgren, and she developed this monumental group knitting project with 84, I think it was, knitters standing in a circle. I was one of them because I was there for In the Loop, and it was called Own Your Own Time, and it had to do with owning the time, like we're all knitting in a circle, passing it on one big brown these needles, and then we pass it to the person to the left and take the one to the right. So it was all a continuous loop, continuous circle. And it was about preserving your time there in Shetland in those rows of knitting that was in that. And she took this all over the world and had people gather in these big circles and knit. And so that, that was a really interesting experience. So that's
everybody was knitting on the same piece. It was
being yeah. Well, there were separate pieces. Originally, there were separate pieces, and then she had connected them through these, circular knitting needles. But I'm not sure how she did that, but they were all connected into one big round, and we were all knitting. So you went at the pace of the slowest knitter. You knitted across, and then you slid that over to the next person, and it went around, and we did 3 rounds in an hour. It was so cold. What I remember is just being so cold.
Oh, sounds so interesting. I've never heard of anything like that.
Yeah, it's Kristen, I believe it was Lindgren was her name, and she went to, oh gosh, Iceland, I think she started in the Faroe Islands. it's just like, because I'm a knitter and I can participate in these things, it just opens so many worlds to me of experience that I otherwise wouldn't have, and meeting people I wouldn't otherwise meet. I also traveled with the Vesterheim Museum of Norwegian American History, which is in Decorah, Iowa. They do a textile tour every couple of years. And because this is organized by Lauranne Gilbertson, who's at the museum, is the curator at the museum, she can get us into, behind the scenes and get us into meeting people. That was really wonderful too. That was, yeah, seeing the knitting there. Those people know their knitting, man.
I was hoping that you might say something about the Costume Society of America, because
Oh,
I
sure.
saw that you were involved somehow with conservation and preservation, which
Yeah.
is very topical.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anything about the interwar period that you may have seen or worked on?
Well, actually, no. We worked on, there were some organizers of that, and they set us up to work with a specific museum or historical site that needed help, just needed work done. And there would be 30 to 40 of us who would come in, and we'd do a year's worth of work in a day, whatever they needed. And it could be sorting, it could be labeling, it could be writing descriptions, um, making mounts, whatever they needed. But I worked with one museum, I worked with embroidered samplers from the 1800s. We also we did another project in New Orleans, and we worked at a museum that held Civil War era, I think it was, uniforms and flags. And we did some work in Arizona. Anyway, we were at the Ukrainian Museum in Ohio. And so it was usually very specific need that was there, and not so much really seeing the clothing that had been worn necessarily. So very specialized, but wonderful project that's still going on. I'm a little more off the grid these days with what I'm doing. I've kind of gotten interested in some other things, but it is a wonderful organization, and that particularly is um, really fine effort toward conservation and preservation, which is just so expensive. They're always understaffed and underfunded, all those places. And so if they can get a group of people who are knowledgeable to go in and already be well organized, can really get a lot of work done and help them to be better conservators. Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a big symposium at the Metropolitan Museum on textile conservation.
Mm.
And as soon as I read about it and I went to sign up, it was already sold out.
Oh my gosh.
So I was bummed, because I thought it would be interesting to go there and see. Of course, they're very involved because they have the Costume Institute.
Of course. Yes, of course. Oh, yeah, that did remind me, when you talk about patterns, the Victoria and Albert Museum has the knitting library, or whatever, knitting sister. Yeah, Ruth, I can't think of her last name, started that. I met her because I'd written an article about a knitted mitten that I found from like dating to the 1550s. I found it at the Museum of London, which is often overlooked. And I'd written this up, and I met her later, the woman who started this. She's a Victorian reenactor. And she said, well, there's an American woman who wrote this. And I said, well, that was me. And she said, oh, I just thought for an American, not bad. So apparently I kind of got it right. And that, because I was working on the idea that knitting is part of the Renaissance, because knitting it's a relatively new, well, mostly new in terms of measuring people doing it, but it really follows the trajectory of the Renaissance, starting in Italy. And you have all these marvelous, knitted ecclesiastical silk gloves and so on, which another friend of mine just wrote a book about that. Anhart Thomas just wrote that book, did wonderful research on it. And then it kind of, spreads around Italy, and it goes to France. And then finally it gets to England, which was relatively later in the Renaissance. And so that's what I thought I was seeing with this little mitten. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. So that's another place where there are patterns, I know, though, that VNA.
Yes, they have
library.
patterns online,
That's
actually.
a repository, yeah.
And they have the Schiaparelli sweater, the trompe l'oeil bow. They have one of them also.
They do wonderful exhibits there. It's one of my favorites. Yes.
So I know another area of your expertise is apparel design and merchandising. Just tell us generally about how yarn and knitwear were merchandised in my favorite time period.
Okay. Well, I mentioned it a little bit. Oh gosh, I didn't really teach merchandising. I taught in a apparel design and merchandising program, but I taught the liberal arts core. So I taught the history and the culture and so on. But I certainly absorbed a lot of what those professors were teaching. And I tried to work in a history of advertising into every decade that I taught in the history of dress. It was just so important. I mentioned a little bit that in the 1930s, they really got up to speed with advertising and with merchandising. And the yarn manufacturers kind of came into their own. They wanted to sell yarn and they needed to sell yarn after the war. So they used to have these, they would hire women, identify women who would be good instructors, and they'd bring them to New York or Chicago, give them these wonderful vacations learning to be good knitting instructors who of course would be selling their yarn, and that's one way that they were merchandising it. Another way was, and that turned out to be, as I learned from the Dry Good Merchants Trade Journal, that turned out to be the most effective, maybe this won't surprise you, the most effective way to encourage people to knit is to teach them how to do it well. And then they're going to knit, and then they're going to buy your yarn. And the other way that they got them to knit is to link them in with fashion and what was going on with fashion. And I don't care where people are, they want to keep up with fashion. It's amazing. And they do. And so they would educate their instructors who would return and just keep people knitting, and they would sponsor these fabulous fashion shows that would travel around the country. And then that, of course, was to encourage people to knit these wonderful fashions that they had and to buy the pattern books. And again, they're selling lifestyle. It's like, don't you want to look like, in the movies, of course, you can't overlook that in the movies, selling through the movies as well. That was, and the department stores themselves. I mean, that's an interesting history because department stores freed women. I mean, when you look at the late 19th century, women couldn't really go anywhere. For one thing, there weren't bathrooms, so they couldn't stay out that long. They weren't really, it wasn't really considered proper for women to go out on their own. They needed to have a male escort. And when you had department stores, that was a safe place where women could go on their own. There were restrooms, for one thing. They could go and spend a longer time there, and it was considered proper. And if you've been in the department stores in France, oh my goodness, and of course England, and then Marshall Field's here, and all the other department stores, I mean, they're just palaces. And so that was another way that they were merchandised, was again, anyone could come into them. And so they were very democratic in that way.
Have you seen images of how yarns were displayed? Were they in bins on the wall the way they are today, or was there something else going on?
The photos that I've seen from this merchandising journal, the yarns were in bins, and the windows, the front windows, there were very imaginative displays of yarn to bring attention to them. And the knitted samples, the full samples, very, very important, as they are today in yarn stores. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you go into a yarn store, if they have a lot of samples, you're going to come out with yarn because you want to make what it is. You see the possibilities
And
there.
in that color, if they're showing it in lavender, you want it in lavender.
That's right.
Because you know how it looks. And
yeah,
a lot of people
you
don't
do.
have the imagination to say,
Yeah.
they're maybe not as visual to say, well, if I knit it in red, I don't really know how it's going to look, but I see it in lavender and I know how that looks and I like it.
And that some of the people who work in yarn stores get very frustrated with that because they want people to be more imaginative, but they're not. And that brings me to Virginia Woods Bellamy and number knitting, if I may. This is an actual book, and I have to credit my good friend Anne Broughton, who is at, let's see, she's a curator at North Dakota State University in Fargo. And she found this book. Look online. If you can find one for $250, you're doing good. She found this
I heard they're like $700.
Are they now? Whoa.
But I'm going to shortly interview a woman who has reproduced it digitally and she's really into it. But
yes,
the scarf that you were wearing, you told me before we started recording, is by that system.
Well, what I have here are two pieces that were actually knitted by Virginia Woods Bellamy.
Oh,
and they also came from that estate sale. Anne found these. Anne found 3 of these. Here's another one. I'll just kind of hold that up from that. You can see it's a type of entrelac knitting, and it's so light. She was knitting with wool warp yarn is what she was knitting with. And she was knitting back in the 1930s. She was really a poet. And she has an interesting history. Anyway, they're kind of weighted with beads and so on. So that's kind of a sweet little scarf. But these were actually from the estate sale and knitted by Virginia Woods Bellamy. This one, a bigger one, very big. You can see, very large. This is probably, I know this is probably wool, but it's a large stole. And these are also from the book, were knitted from the book. So Anne Broughton was the person who teased out the history of Virginia Woods Bellamy and really found her again. And I know we've been contacted by the person you're talking about, and but Anne found that, and we published an article on that. We presented it at Costume Society. We published an article. We went on to publish several articles. This is from 1946. This is a number knitting article by Virginia Bellamy, and so anyway, the Puff Bunny wardrobe, I mean, we did everything about Virginia Woods Bellamy, and I recreated some of her knits. These were all published in Piecework magazine and in Knitting Traditions, and it's a fascinating story. But the reason that what you're saying about conforming to knitting yarns and colors, it relates to Virginia Woods Bellamy, is that she hated that. She wanted to free knitters from the tyranny of the designer. And so she invented this method of, we would call it an entrelac knitting, I guess, called number knitting, and wrote it in this book. Well, first she published other things before this. And then she started a correspondence course. This is 1952 when she published this. And Anne Broughton teased out her personal history with cold calls. And through cold calls, she found Virginia Woods Bellamy's grandson, and who lived in, I think, Washington, D.C. or Virginia or somewhere. And she said, are you just by calling people with the name and saying, are you by any chance related to? And she found the grandson, who said, well, I don't remember much about her, but you may want to talk to my mom. And that was her daughter. So Anne was in one-to-one contact with her daughter for years, who we think may have passed away because we've been out of touch with her. So I have to credit Anne Broughton with that. She found the book. She found these knits by Virginia Woods Bellamy, and she gave them to me because she decided she wasn't going to do anything with them, but she thought I might. So we ended up with a collaboration in which I analyzed the knitting and we published some patterns, and then
I saw the red dress. I went to read one of the articles that you wrote, and I saw the red dress.
Oh, that was a follow-up one, because Anne also found the person, I think in Moorhead, Minnesota, where Virginia Woods Bellamy's son taught there, and at Moorhead, which is why all this material was there. Virginia used to go out there and stay with him in the summers. And so I guess when she passed away, he got all these books and all this knitting. and just kept it. And it finally went out in his estate sale, which is when Anne got them. But she only bought 3 pieces of her knitting, and there was a big pile of them. So there's a whole bunch of Virginia Woods Bellamy's knitting there. And Anne found out who had bought that and got permission to photograph those. So we did a follow-up about that. So yeah, we've been asked to do an exhibit for CKC, an online exhibit, which hasn't quite happened yet, but there are so many projects to do. It's hard to get at them. So that
So
was really fun to do.
I fell down that rabbit hole after I read your article.
Good.
I got very intrigued by it and started, delving into it, which is why I want to interview Kelly Vaughn, who I guess will get more into the nuts and the bolts.
As I understand it, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a very interesting digression. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not in touch with her, so I don't know.
How was it to knit that shawl? Was it?
Oh, it was lovely. It was just lovely. I actually used mohair. I used a very fine wool, and what did I use? It's just like a really big needles and well, here's this shawl. Used oh gosh, I did it a while ago. You can see the angle though in the it was lovely to knit. And she is just adamant about wanting women to feel liberated from patterns and designs and to be able to do their own designs, choose their own colors, and she was quite a person. I really admire her, and she was first of all a poet, and that was the most important thing to her. Her daughter said that she wrote a poem every morning when she got up.
Wow.
And her daughter also
poetry. There's a lot of poetry in this book that you found and inserted.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The book is great. So are there other books in the works besides your memoir?
Oh, thank you. Well, I write regularly for Piecework magazine, and I'm an editorial advisor for Piecework, and I usually write 1 or 2 articles for them every year. I'm working on an article right now about Mother Hildegard and her Cotswold sheep up on Shaw Island at Our Lady of the Rock Monastery. And I'm doing that for Long Thread Media and Farm to Fiber Knits, their new online magazine. So I'm working on that. And I'm working on, for Piecework, I'm working on an article about tiny mittens, really, really tiny mittens. Look at these little guys.
Oh.
Yeah, some of these from Latvia, some from Norway and Denmark. Some of them gifts, some of them I found for sale. So I'm working on those, learning a lot of the history of that from a friend, and some other things, but it doesn't involve knitting. So mainly I'm really interested in these short pieces and the writing. During the pandemic, I connected with a writing professor I'd had in graduate school, and she organized a group of 12 memoirists, and we stayed together all through lockdown, and the books are now starting to come out from that experience. Really fascinating people. And my memoir is about the importance of knitting in my life, and I'm calling it Loopy because knitting is all about loops, and my life has been a little loopy, so it fits. And my working subtitle is How Knitting Saved My Sanity, which it did for a lot of years, and how knitting opened the door to the world for me, which it did later after I learned my true calling, which was textiles. So I'd like to find a publisher for that, but I haven't been trying very hard because mostly I like to write. But I am excited about starting to write for Substack. I am really excited about that. And I'm going
Can
to
you
post
explain Substack for people watching who might not know about it?
Oh, sure. Substack, just Google Substack and you'll find that it is, basically it's blogs. We'll call them newsletters, but they're basically blogs. But they're blogs written by journalists and by writers who are really excellent writers. And people are publishing whole novels, chapter by chapter there. Journalists are using it. A lot of political writers are using it to do, it's just more in depth than a blog would be. Although some people are kind of treating it like a blog, you can do that. But I'm treating it as chapters in a book. I mean, writing that is finished as I would send it off to a publisher for a story about my encounters with knitting, which is where I'm starting, because I am doing an inventory of all my knitting and plant my knitting collection and my textile teaching collection, which is from all over the world. And I'm planning to donate that to the Avenir Museum in Colorado, as much as they will accept, because I want it to be used as a teaching collection.
Is there a way for people to follow your Substack?
Yeah, they just donate. They just Google Susan Strawn at Substack.
Okay.
I'm also on Facebook. I do Facebook. And yeah, and Facebook is just, Facebook, just my name, Susan Strawn. And I post things about knitting sometimes, and about living in the Pacific Northwest, and about any other needlework kinds of things that come up. I'll post it there. And I have a web designer who's designing a web page for me right now, just so, I don't know, people can find me or something. I don't know. We're kind of dragging our heels on that. I'm not, honestly, I just like to do the work. I just like the stuff. I like the material things, and I like to write about it. I love to find the stories in it. I love the surprises I find, the history, the technology. I just love doing that. And then I think, oh boy, I want people to read this. Now I gotta market it.
There's so many millions of questions that one could ask you because of your background, but like, we're out of time. I mean, I could probably interview you 17 more times. Any one of your degrees would be like a whole interview in and of itself. And then any one of your articles, the Mexican tourist jackets.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, we'll talk with you later about that. I have a little news for you.
I mean,
Yeah.
when I was in college, my freshman year roommate had one.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been meaning to call her up and ask her, Jackie, do you still have it? And I see them on eBay, they come up. Excuse me. I just don't know how old they are. Like, I know hers was old. Hers was probably from the 40s, because we were there in the early 70s, and it was already looking old. And I think there's a little moth bite in it.
Yeah, this is mostly post-war, and what's fascinating is that I bought one of those, and I showed it to a cultural Spanish studies professor at the university where I taught, and she said, "Oh yeah, that's El Charro and Chalchino Problema." And I went, "What?" And so we ended up with a collaboration in which we reconstructed, on the basis of that jacket, we reconstructed the post-World War II history of the political history of Mexico and the U.S. Now you gotta tell me, that's fun.
Wow,
That's fun. I have the sewing pattern. I have the McCall sewing pattern, so you can make your own.
You do?
I own that. Yep.
Wow, love to see that.
Yep. Do you know about the Rhode Island School of Design knitting pattern library?
No, why
Sorry,
keep that a secret?
Well, it doesn't have to do with the knitting. It's not the Rhode Island School of Design. I'm sorry. It is the University of Rhode Island, and it is their pattern library. It is the history of commercial pattern library. It's all online.
Oh, so not knitting patterns, sewing patterns.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking knitting right now. It's sewing patterns. It's all sewing patterns, not knitting patterns. But it's the history of sewing patterns. But what that gives you is this beautiful timeline of what people were wearing. And that is still relevant to knitting patterns. But it's all been digitized now, and you can call it up by year, by style. It's brilliant. A woman named Joy Emery started that, and she has written a book, The History of Commercial Paper Patterns. I think you have to write to the University of Rhode Island and their department in order to get the password to join this. But once you have, so I use that quite a bit when um, I'm looking at timeline,
Now
historical.
they're going to get deluged with people watching this program.
I hope so. Well, where I've used it is another time, a little sideline that I developed in retirement, which was analyzing vintage photographs according to what people are wearing, according to their clothing, dating them and doing an analysis of it. And that has been
I have
really
one for
useful.
you. I have one for you.
If you
Well,
send me a photo, I will comment on it. Just a genealogy society here that I ended up developing extensive PowerPoints and presentations for them about how to do this
it's
based
not
on,
American. I mean, that's the problem.
oh, well, that's okay.
Mm,
No.
I somehow years ago was trying to figure out what is this person in my family, I think around 1904,
Okay.
in, I think, Nagasaki, Japan, wearing a very unusual costume with writing, like a sash with writing on it, and the writing was in English. And the costume was very, very strange. And finally, I thought, well, my New York Public Library has research librarians who are
Mhm.
on call, and I contacted them, but when they're not available, they route you to other research librarians, and I got on with a research librarian from Yale University,
Mhm.
and that person was fabulous. They said, I have to go on my dinner break, but I will get back to you in an hour. And they did, which I couldn't believe. They were so intrigued by the photo.
Mhm.
Really, like, they just couldn't come up with much.
Oh dear.
It's like moon and stars something, but was it some, maybe like a charity ball or something for
Mm.
maybe an organization, but what that
Mhm.
organization was unknown.
Mm.
And there's no one in my family alive today who can shed
Ah.
any more light on it. It was probably like if you went out trick-or-treating and you were wearing some weird costume, like 120 years from now, would anybody be able to identify, oh, that was Darth Vader? Maybe. I mean, that's like big culture, but if it was like
Yeah.
some local thing that happened, anyway,
Well,
there
I'll tell
are
you,
fabulous librarians out there for sure.
librarians are the best.
If you
They
get a
really
good
are
one.
the best people. It's just amazing. So, I've had just in my genealogy society here after I gave those talks, and then we did workshops where they brought in photos and we did analysis, and they just, this is a whole new world for them. They never thought to look for it.
I
And
have a
so
lot
then
of
they
these.
started sending,
I
yeah, then they
have
started
lots.
sending me photos then, and looking at it, and it was just, oh, so much fun.
I'm
So I used the
also
paper.
interested in genealogy, and I
Yeah.
have gathered from members of my family many, many vintage photos. And a lot of people in my family lived in Asia, turn of the century,
Mhm.
not from 19th century to 20th century, so more than 100 years ago. And I have a lot
Mm.
of like wedding photos, the bridal party, what they were wearing, and I know the years of the wedding, so it dates the clothing that the people are wearing and the types of hats.
Mhm.
So yes, I'm fascinated
Mm.
by that too.
Yeah, it's a wonderful. It was just a whole new area that I had time to pursue once I was no longer teaching, and it was just really kind of exciting. I don't know if that's going anywhere. I always thought that was very publishable, but I haven't. Like I said, I love to do the work, and then I get to publishing. The reason I published that knitting book was that they found me and asked me if I'd do it, and that's usually what happens for me. Is somebody finds me and says, "Well, would you do this? Would you, oh, yeah, okay." So that's usually what happens. I've never had to go out and like find anybody to
How
do it.
long did this take you?
Oh, well, I was building on a little bit of research that I had done while I was in graduate school and while I was at Interweave Press. The information about communal societies and a little bit of it, and the department store information. Um, I had when I started, but I signed the contract in April of 2004 to write that book and also to move to Chicago from Colorado and teach full-time at a university. I signed it the same month. Believe me, I hope to never work this hard again. And the book, I did the book in a little over a year and a half, a little over a year and a half. And like I said, I never want to work that hard again in my life. I did nothing but work for that whole
It's
time.
like a lifetime of work. I mean,
Yes.
it's
I,
so
I don't know. I don't
cool.
know. Well, with, a lot of those things, I had some collections of objects that I could use. I had, and
Still
otherwise, well,
assembling it
so
and waiting
it
all
was
the
amazing. Yeah. But online, I could do things like I mentioned with Mary Maxim. I could get that information. Brittany knitting needles. I remember breaking apart some myths about those. And the American Memory Site, which was the first digitization site from the Library of Congress. It's now been broken up into other sites, but the American Memory Site was absolutely fabulous. That was how I found all those letters to the presidents that mentioned knitting. And you just pull it up, American Memory Site, letters from the presidents, and then I put in knitting, and I get all these letters, original letters, and then transcribed, taught from Washington, from Lincoln, especially President Lincoln, letters that were written to him about the knitting that people were doing for the war. It just, fabulous stuff like that. And at one point, I had three people who read that book, as I was writing, and one of them was Paula Becker, who's done some wonderful work with Washington State history, and so I ended up with some, short pieces that they had written because there's no way I could improve on it. And Paula said, "Well, what about the Mormons? Weren't they knitters?" I'm going, "The Mormons? How did I miss the Mormons? Of course they were knitting, fabulous knitters." So I'd email off like, "Yes, yes, daughters of the Mormon pioneers. What have you got for knitting? I don't have time to come to Salt Lake City. What have you got?" And I would get a librarian saying, "Let me take my camera and go photograph what we have and send you what I have." And so we'd end up with, there's my section about the Mormons, or the women who, with the Communal Studies Association, who did Civil War reenactment and did patterns for that.
So you're obviously masterful researcher. You know how to get it done. You know who to reach out to and the right questions to ask. And
well,
that's incredible. I mean, I can't say that I've ever seen another book on knitting like this. Now, people will probably write in the comments like, "Oh yeah, do you know this book, that book?"
Well, there's the only ones I know, Anne MacDonald, and she was writing before the internet was really, No Idle Hands, which is a fine book. And then there's Bishop Rutt's book. And Bishop Rutt, when he gets to it's history of world knitting, he was English, and world knitting. And when he gets to like the category, the history of American knitting, his first sentence is, information about the history of American knitting is very hard to find. Well, I beg to differ. The history of American knitting is overwhelming when you get into it. But as one of my mentors and my former boss, Linda Ligon of Interweave Press, said, she said, "I'm a digger." That's what I'm a persistent digger. I love to dig out information. And then
he didn't have the advantage of the internet at his fingertips.
Yes,
I think that makes a huge
that's
difference.
right.
And I'm sure he didn't have all of these images.
No.
I mean, to me, the book is really, really enriched by the images. If you just looked at the images, you would have eye candy and like a history lesson.
You would. And that's what I always tell people when they buy it is, just look at the pictures and read the captions and then go back and read as it interests you.
The text is also just super, super fascinating and amazing. So I think this is a really good point to like say thank you so much to you for being here with me as it gets so dark outside. I can't believe it feels like midnight, but it's not.
does. Well,
Thank
Billie,
you so much for answering all my questions and for spending the time and
well, I have to tell you, thank you, Billie, so much for inviting me. When I get these kind of invitations, I just think, is this worth my while time or not? And it definitely was. You've just been a delightful interviewer and asked really good questions and kind of pointed me in the direction so that I could be a little better prepared to answer them. And I thank you very much
aren't you
for giving me this time to talk about something there's kind of nothing I'd rather talk about. So it's a gift. To be able to do this. I so appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing your edit of my incredible meandering. My Substack title is Susan Strawn Meanders, just through textile and knitting history. And so you probably, and maybe one day maybe somebody will pick up my memoir and publish it. Maybe I'll start pushing that harder and see if I can get a publisher. Because
well, comment below, people watching, if you know somebody.
Everybody knows a good, like I'm looking for a small publisher, that focused publisher here. And my memoir is also going to include the pattern. Every chapter is the name of something I was knitting during that time period in my life or during that travel. And so it's the name and I was an illustrator by profession, and so it's my own illustrations of that book. And so it's my illustration and the subject, and then there are the instructions for how to make it. So it's going to be a good book. I just am not.
It sounds like it.
I just rather write. Oh dear. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.